Good Shabbos. This week's portion is Parsha Shmini, but it's also a special Shabbos where we read the section dealing with the Parah Aduma, with the red heifer. The red heifer was a cow which was completely red, and it was also burned completely, and that was done outside of the temple. And the ashes were used to sprinkle on people who had become spiritually impure by coming in contact with someone who died. And as a result of the sprinkling, now anyone who was sprinkled with this could re-enter the temple grounds, which beforehand he was forbidden or she was forbidden as a result of being spiritually impure. When the rabbis in the Talmud and the Medrash talk about this section, they say this is your classical chok. A chok is a statute, a law that doesn't seem to have a reason, but more likely a law which we don't understand the reason. And they say that this is the classical case because there's something about this which makes no sense. And that's the following, that somebody, the Kohen, I should say, who was in charge of taking care of this Parah Aduma, of the red heifer, he had to be pure when he started. He had to be spiritually pure or tahar when he started the process. And going through the process makes him tameh, makes him impure for one day. And what's odd is that it says that this is something that is metame taharim. It makes impure those that were pure. And of course, the ashes, as I mentioned before, are metaher tameim. It makes those that are impure pure. So how is that? That something which causes purity could also cause impurity. So I'd like to address that and also address one of the other conditions that has to be met for this red heifer, and that's that it has to be a tamima, it has to be unblemished, but even more so, that's simply similar to other offerings, but it also has to be lo ola aleha ol. A yoke never was on this animal. The animal was never worked. The question is why? Why is it so special that it had never be touched, meaning never used for any work, for any labor? And I think we have to understand when the Talmud tells us that this is something which is very difficult to understand, we have to think about what the symbolism is. It's not just the law of the Parah Aduma, the red heifer, but it obviously, in my mind, symbolizes something else. And I think one of the most important questions, a theological question or philosophical question that we have within Judaism, as in any other religion, is why do bad things happen to good people? And there's many ways to understand this and to discuss this, but this I think epitomizes that question. Now, why am I saying it has anything to do with that question? Well, the truth is, somebody who comes in contact with death is impure because of their association with death. And death, in my understanding, is the ultimate evil. And we know that death happens to people who are even innocent, because there's nobody who escapes death. No matter how pure you are, no matter how righteous you are, it doesn't matter, you were eventually going to die. The Talmud even tells us that there's 4 people throughout history which never sinned at all and didn't deserve death, but they only got death because of the sin of Adam and Chava, of Adam and Eve. In other words, death now exists in the world even for people who don't deserve it. That seems to be the classical case of tzaddik v'ralo, a righteous person which something bad happens to them. Why? Because the ultimate evil, death, occurs to them, and they didn't deserve it at all. Or even if they might have sinned, they didn't necessarily sin to the degree which they deserve death, and yet it occurs. So we're dealing with trying to remove the impurity which is associated with death, and I believe the impurity is partly because of the questions that arise when we come in contact with death. We start to challenge our own ideas. We start to challenge religion. We start to challenge the existence of God. We don't understand why God would allow such evil to occur in this world. So perhaps what we do is we say, you know what? This is a question which has to be dealt with before you enter the temple. It's something which is associated with someone who cannot enter the temple, who feels now they're distant from God, they're distant from the temple, they're distant from the Shekhinah, divine presence which rests in the temple area. And now we have to deal with it outside the temple. We have to address it before we re-enter. And what do we bring? We bring a para aduma. The word aduma is red, and many people say that red is associated with the egel hazav, the golden calf, and this is really just an atonement for that sin that was done by the Jewish people. But another possibility is that the word aduma also is similar to the word adam, a man or a human being, and it's really saying we're bringing a cow which symbolizes a human being, which is tamima, which is pure, unblemished, not necessarily sinful, certainly not deserving of death. And lo Allah allow, oh, nothing, it didn't even work. It's almost like a childlike innocence this this cow has. And that's symbolizing the human beings, maybe even a child who's completely innocent. We don't even have to talk about an adult who went through his life and didn't deserve to die. Any child who dies in infancy or as a young child certainly didn't deserve to die. They still haven't made any choices which could consider them that they're evil, that they've wronged God, if they've sinned. It's not possible. So that's what this cow represents. And that's why the Talmud says this is a question which no one understood. They didn't understand how it could be metame taharim and metar tameim, how it could impurify those that are pure and vice versa. And perhaps what it's really saying is that we have to realize that we don't know the answer to this question. In other words, this is the ultimate chok. This is the ultimate statute, which we don't understand the reason. And perhaps one possibility is that the answer to the question is that we don't know the answer, and that we have to realize that we're not going to know the answer to this question. In other words, what bothers us about this is that we can't understand how there could be a God who acts in this way. So it removes us from religion to a certain degree. It removes us from our belief in God. But if we understand that there are certain questions that nobody is ever going to know the answer to, whether you believe in God or not, then it somewhat satisfies your need to have this answer, and you say, okay, I understand that even though I was challenged with this and I'm working on this all my life, I'm not going to know the answer. I'll never know the answer. So it's not going to affect me one way or the other. It's not that I'm going to find the answer and it's going to explain why I should or should not believe in God. There's never going to be an answer. So therefore, when you address that to someone who's come in contact with death, who's seen punishment that seems to be undeserved, they might be satisfied with the fact that we don't know the answer. We are never going to know the answer. But when you take the Kohen, the priest, who wasn't involved with anything Tameh, he's not impure. He didn't have the question. And then you bring to him this issue, that's what causes his tumah, that causes the impurity. In other words, someone who's innocent in the sense that they never had the question, when you address that question to them, it causes doubt in their mind. It causes them to be distant from God. But when you have people who are troubled by that question and you tell them there's no answer, now that there's no answer, they're willing to sort of go ahead and say, I'm never going to know. So therefore, perhaps that's what this is talking about when it says it's something which we don't understand, and that's why it's symbolic of a human being who was completely innocent, and that is how it purifies us. Sometimes the answer to our question is that we have to realize that we're human beings with limited knowledge, with limited understanding. We're not going to be apprehend ever in our lifetime all the questions that disturb us and that challenge us in our belief of God. Good Shabbos.